Warren Alney back with To the Point. In Vienna today, negotiators in the Iran nuclear talks have extended their deadline until next Tuesday as they struggle to find a permanent solution. At the same time, the European Union has extended its suspension of economic sanctions for another week. How will that sound in Iran? Thomas Erdbrink is Tehran bureau chief for the New York Times. And Thomas, it's always good to have you on our program.
And it's great to be back, Warren.
By all accounts, the Iranians want these sanctions lifted. What is, do you think, happening in Iran? And is there great pressure on the Ayatollah to get this over with?
Well, absolutely. I mean, Iran has gone through a very slow and much unnoticed development in which a lot of people basically turned from being revolutionary to middle class. And that means that they want a peaceful life, they want to send their kids to school, they want to travel abroad. And, of course, that means that the confrontation with the West, which has led to a whole range of sanctions coming down on the Iranian people, is no longer as popular as it was 10 years ago. So Ayatollah Ali Khamenei has faced a very difficult time managing both his supporters, the hardliners in Iran, who basically don't want to have any deal, and the big silent majority of middle-class Iranians who want to move forward.
You went, as I understand it, to a meeting of hardliners today.
Yes, it was incredibly hot, and the hardliners were supposed to gather 1 million people. But when I arrived at Tehran's Freedom Monument, a famous rallying point for political marches here, there were only around 200 people. And they were easily filmed by the international media, by Iranian media. And of course, this sort of underscores, on one hand, their power, because they can have such meetings without the police intervening. They are free to criticize any possible deal. But at the same time, it underscores their dwindling popularity. Because when I asked someone, so where are your 1 million people instead of these 200, they answered me, well, they're at work, they might come later. But of course, nobody showed up.
Once again, the European Union extended its suspension of economic sanctions, which was scheduled to go in effect today if, in fact, the deadline for a negotiation was met. Does that suggest, particularly to the Iranians, that Europe is eager to end the sanctions so it can do business with Iran?
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at, for instance, Germany, which we were just talking about in the other item, for decades was Iran's biggest trading partner, making over $30 billion here every year. Now this has dwindled down to maybe a percentage of that amount. So lots of European companies are willing to get back into Iran, and you also see this in the shape of delegations visiting here. Eni, the big Italian oil giant, was here, and of course Shell, one of the biggest companies in the world, Iranian, Dutch Anglo-Saxon Shell, also came here, sent a delegation, and they want to deal with the Iranians.
Once again, Thomas Erdbrink is Tehran bureau chief for the New York Times. Today at a news conference in Washington, President Obama had this to say with regard to the framework agreement that was established in Lausanne, France, earlier this year.
The framework agreement that was established at Lausanne is one that, if implemented effectively and codified properly, would in fact achieve my goal, which is Iran not obtaining a nuclear weapon.
5 former members of the president's inner circle of Iran advisors have written an open letter expressing concern about the nuclear program and whether the agreement might fall short of meeting the administration's own standards. One of those was Ambassador Dennis Ross, counselor and William Davidson Distinguished Fellow now at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, served as special assistant to President Barack Obama from 2009 to 2011, and has been involved in negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians for many, many years. Ambassador Ross, it's always good to have you on our program, and thanks for joining us.
Always good to be with you. Thank you, Warren.
Do you disagree with what we just heard from the president, that the agreement established in Lausanne would establish his goal of Iran not obtaining a nuclear weapon?
Well, what I agree is that if the Lausanne agreement is fulfilled, it will certainly defer Iran's ability to pursue a nuclear weapon for about 15 years. it will not remove it as an option because Iran's nuclear infrastructure is largely maintained for that time, and then after 15 years it could be expanded significantly. But in effect, when we did this joint statement, it was really more a statement than a letter. What we were doing was outlining principles that are themselves consistent with the framework understanding that was negotiated in Lausanne, and what we were focused on was trying to ensure that those thresholds, in fact, don't become eroded.
So were you attempting to put an end to the agreement, or were you simply advising the president in a public way, as you used to do privately, about how to proceed?
I think it was much more designed to be supportive of the effort to negotiate an agreement consistent with the framework understanding. It wasn't designed to make it harder to reach an agreement. It was designed to ensure that the agreement would meet the standard that the administration itself had identified, and that those principles that, as I said, were consistent with the framework understanding would not become further eroded. Understand, we didn't do this prior to the time that the Supreme Leader had come out and laid out a series of conditions, all of which were inconsistent with the framework understanding. So part of what we were doing was, in some ways, saying, look, if the Supreme Leader is going to put pressure on his negotiators to walk back what was in the framework understanding, we can certainly be supportive of the administration by making it clear that those principles need to be maintained, and the administration is dealing with mainstream people who feel this is a standard that needs to be upheld.
Former Ambassador Dennis Ross. Let me go back to Thomas Erdbrink, Tehran bureau chief for the New York Times. What about the Supreme Leader's comments last week? What do you think they were designed, well, what did he say, and what do you think was the goal?
Well, let's first establish the fact that the Supreme Leader has been in power here for 20 years and has always been a sort of ultimate balancer between rival factions inside Iran, but also with his foreign policy. And instead of solving problems, he more prefers to sort of, if you will, reduce pressure or increase pressure at certain times. We saw this in 2003 to 2005 when the Supreme Leader had one of his presidents negotiate with Europe. That failed. Then he decided to increase the pressure. Enter Ahmadinejad, the Holocaust denier that drove the West wild of anger because of his infuriating remarks. At the same time, the Iranians managed to advance their nuclear program from 64 centrifuges to 19,000 centrifuges, which by international standards is still quite a modest program. And now we are in the phase of, again, negotiations. The Supreme Leader tries to keep his supporters, the hardliners that I was just talking about, in check, but at the same time, he feels this pressure of this big silent majority that wants changes and that wants better relations with the West and also with the United States.
Let me go back to former Ambassador Dennis Ross. Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel, a man you're very familiar with, made a statement on Sunday saying that there is nothing left of the original U.S. pledges on the Iran deal. It says that now Tehran is being let off the hook on its past secrets, doesn't have to reveal those, that it would be free to approve, deny, or delay permission for inspections, and that it had achieved what it wanted at the expense of what the president wants. Do you agree with the Prime Minister on that?
Well, I don't think that the U.S. has walked away from those principles. If they had, we'd already have an agreement with the Iranians because we would have conceded on those issues. So the administration hasn't done that. Clearly what we were trying to do in the statement that we put out was, again, be consistent with the principles that were established in the framework understanding, one of which was there would be no sanctions relief until Iran fulfilled the major obligations, the most significant obligations that were built into the framework understanding, one of which was that, in fact, they had to address the questions on the possible military dimensions of their program, and that meant answering the questions of the IAEA in a way that provided access to sites, to documents, and to the personnel, including the scientists involved in those programs, in those labs that were connected with possible experiments related to the possible military dimension or weaponization.
So that's one of the things that Prime Minister Netanyahu says as well, that Washington has backed down on its insistence on predicating sanctions relief on Iran's compliance. So with that, I take it, you do agree with the Prime Minister.
Well, I'm saying we haven't done that. We have not done that. Had we done that, That's one of the things that the Supreme Leader, in effect, is saying: no access to military sites, no interrogation of Iranian scientists, and one of the issues that is, in fact, being negotiated even now, one of the things that is holding up, I think, an agreement is this is what I believe the administration is insisting on, and obviously I am, along with a number of my former colleagues, believe it's very important that that be one of the standards that be maintained if there's going to be an agreement.
If you were being supportive, why did you have to do it in a public way?
Well, in a sense, I think it became a statement of bipartisan support. It wasn't just 5 former members of the administration. Here was a bipartisan statement supporting principles. Each one of those principles was fully consistent with the framework understanding. This was a way of publicly demonstrating for the administration that if they can reach an agreement consistent with those principles, there's a mainstream bipartisan consensus that will support that. And that, I think, is something that is very much in the administration's interest, but it also has the benefit of putting our negotiators in a position where they can say to the Iranians, look, whatever pressures you face, we face the reality of the mainstream, not those outside the mainstream. Mainstream people on our side support the principles that were in the framework understanding, but will not support an agreement that falls short of that.
Again, Ambassador Dennis Ross, formerly with the Obama administration and advisor to many administrations prior to that. Emad Kiyaei is Executive Director of the American Iranian Council. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Warren.
What do you think would be acceptable to Iran as far as the relationship between sanctions relief and actions by that country?
Well, at the moment, this is what's being negotiated, and the most important thing is that if the P5+1 and the Iranians reach a comprehensive deal, within the reciprocation for the actions that Iran will take to curtail its nuclear program, to ensure that it's transparent, verifiable, and monitored at the most intrusive levels ever the country has allowed under the NPT and additional protocols. And in return, the P5+1 must deliver on their end of the bargain, which includes removing Chapter 7 UN Security Council sanctions on Iran, and of course, it has indicated that they will be willing to also remove nuclear-related sanctions. And we hope that the Obama administration will be able to also follow through on their end of the bargain.
It appeared that last week the Ayatollah was backing away from some of the promises that had been made previously about transparency, indicating that he would have to approve, or Iran would have to approve inspections, and that certain places simply wouldn't be open for inspection at all.
Well, Warren, you must understand that there's a history of mistrust between Iran and the Western powers. When Iran did open up its military sites, such as Parchin, twice in the whole span of the negotiations from 2003 to 2005, it was followed by, assassination of Iranian scientists. There was sabotage and, covert operations on Iranian military facilities and also nuclear facilities. So, of course, there is a level of mistrust on if Iran just opens up its country to any level of inspection, then, of course, this will be followed through with the actions that they've previously seen, which includes possibly further, sabotage of Iranian facilities. Now, let's be very clear about what's being negotiated. The Iranians, once there is a comprehensive deal, have indicated that they will support what is considered the additional protocol to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty that allows more intrusive inspections by the UN nuclear watchdog in non-nuclear weapon sites as well. So this measure, has a process. So obviously there must be credible evidence that Iran is engaged in some nuclear weapons activity on non-nuclear sites, such as military sites. And if that evidence is viable and credible, then it goes through a process where Iran will then be able to provide that access to the IAEA. But we have to ensure that it's not like just an open plain. No country is going to be able to allow that for national security reasons and obviously the history that I just mentioned.
Ambassador Ross, given that history, does Iran have good reason to be fearful of what might happen? Is their mistrust justified?
Yeah, I have to say that, we have a legion of mistrust when it comes to the Iranians, and they have a pattern of behavior that has given us reasons to mistrust that. They have not revealed nuclear-related activities the way they should have, which is one of the reasons that that we are insisting on this kind of verification. And the fact is that they have not answered the questions of the IAEA, even though twice plans were worked out that they were supposed to follow through on to address the issues that the IAEA was raising on the possible military dimensions. So we have very good reason to be insisting that there be this kind of responsiveness and there be this transparency. Understand, one of the things that has emerged in these negotiations, originally when we began these negotiations, certainly in the first term of the Obama administration, the objective was to have a rollback of sanctions in return for a rollback of the Iranian nuclear infrastructure to the point where the small size of the infrastructure would itself demonstrate the peaceful intent of the program.
Okay, well, we're going to have to let you finish your point after we take a very brief break. We'll be right back with To the Point.
Are you thinking about buying a new car? Consider donating your old one to KCRW and support the unique mix of news, music, and culture you love. You'll become a KCRW member and get a nice tax write-off. For details, visit kcrw.com/cars.
Warren Only back with To the Point, once again talking about the delay, once again, in a deadline for talks on Iran's nuclear project. And before we went to the break, former Ambassador Dennis Ross was explaining the trade-offs originally envisioned between economic sanctions and the size of Iran's nuclear project. Mr. Ambassador, go ahead.
Yeah, what I was getting at is that the essence of what we were trying to do was have a rollback of sanctions in return for rollback of their nuclear infrastructure to the point where that in itself would reveal the peaceful nature of their intent. Now, the fact is we are, in the end, because we couldn't produce that, the administration is accepting a rollback of sanctions in effect for transparency. And it's not that they wouldn't have wanted to produce more, but they came to the conclusion that this kind of a deal would still be sufficient to meet our purposes. But in the end, what it is doing is it's making the key measure on the Iranian side transparency. Now, if we're doing rollback of sanctions and we're not getting complete transparency, then we're really not getting what we need in this deal. So that's why what the administration is insisting on is the kind of transparency, this is what the President was saying today, that gives us a high level of confidence that, in fact, the Iranians will live up to the obligations that they have and that there isn't a covert program going on at the same time.
Emad Kiyaei with the American-Iranian Council. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think it's a bit disingenuous response by Dennis, because if you look at the agreement that was done in April, the political arrangements and the framework, you see that Iran, since the interim deal last year in November and to date, has followed through by its end of the bargain by reducing its number of centrifuges by almost 3/4. It has stopped enrichment for above 5% and has curtailed its redesigning its Arak reactor, so there will be no reprocessing. So all the avenues available for a nuclear weapons program has been stopped under this current agreement. So Iran has taken these measures, and I assure you that it's not just about transparency. These actions certified by the IAEA, there's monitoring on the ground, and Iran's nuclear facilities will take that turn to ensure that there is no highly enriched uranium that could be diverted to a nuclear weapons program. These measures that have been agreed upon goes from A to Z, from procurement of nuclear fissile material all the way into the facilities and onwards, will be tracked and will be verified. So there's no way 1 gram of fissile material can be diverted. This is important to note. This deal will put into place the most comprehensive inspection measures ever a nation, a sovereign state, has agreed to under the NPT. So I believe it's actually a move forward for boosting non-proliferation, not just for Iran, but for the region and globally.
The NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is in charge of doing the inspections, or would be, were that it be to come into effect. Ambassador Ross, your response.
First of all, when you focus on inspections, you're talking about transparency. And when I say a reduction in infrastructure, we're not seeing a reduction in the enrichment infrastructure. The Iranians are not having to destroy a single centrifuge. They have 19,500 centrifuges now. They will be operating they were allowed to operate 6,000, but they will be able to build that up after year 10. And the fact is, after year 15, they will be permitted to build as large an industrial-sized program as they want. So the size of the nuclear infrastructure is not being reduced, at least as it relates to the enrichment. Now, I'm not saying, by the way, that the possible agreement doesn't have good elements in it. I do agree one of the most important elements in this, but again, it relates to transparency, not reduction. One of the most important elements in this is that the whole supply chain is going to be monitored for 25 years. That would be a significant achievement because what it does ensure is that the Iranians would find it very difficult to produce a clandestine program. That's important. But again, it relates to transparency. It does not relate to reducing the size, fundamentally, of their nuclear enrichment infrastructure.
Let me introduce Dalia Dassa Kaye. She is director of the RAND Corporation's Center for Middle East Public Policy. It's good to have you on our program. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Do you see that, or which side do you think has given the most as these negotiations have gone on?
Well, I'm not sure that's the best way to characterize it. The way any negotiation works, both sides have to feel they're getting some gain out of the process and obviously have to give some concessions. I think most outside observers, arms control experts in particular, looking at the framework agreement in Lausanne, have assessed this as actually a pretty strong arms control agreement if it's actually implemented according to the parameters. Of course, we're not in the negotiating room, so we don't know what the final outcome will be yet. But if you get the kind of measures that were just discussed by the previous guest in terms of the intrusive inspections, unprecedented verification measures, this actually would be an unprecedented multilateral arms control agreement. From that perspective, I think the U.S. and our partners in the P5+1 actually come off pretty well because it would essentially prevent and ultimately freeze the Iranian nuclear program and the prospects of them being able to weaponize for the foreseeable future, 10 to 15 years, up to 25 years, as Dennis just suggested, on some aspects. And some aspects of the agreement will be permanent. The additional protocol of the NPT will be a permanent feature of this agreement, which means there will be inspectors watching Iran indefinitely. So I think it would be, if implemented, quite a win on that front. But the Iranians, I think, are gaining a good amount as well. I think they would. It depends on how the process unfolds in terms of implementation. And in many ways, an agreement is just the beginning. But if they get the kind of sanctions relief they're looking for, billions in frozen assets and in increased investment in their oil sector, which is so desperately needed, that is a huge win and probably one of the main reasons the Iranians have went to the negotiating table to begin with, and why the Supreme Leader has endorsed this process.
Tell us why you think it's important for the whole Middle East that this agreement be made.
Well, I think a nuclear-armed Iran would be an incredibly destabilizing feature in the region. It could, I think there's some alarmism about the potential for other countries to engage in their own nuclear programs. A so-called cascade effect is sometimes overblown, but I think the fears are real. The concern in the region about Iran has never just been, or in fact, in many ways, is less about the nuclear issue than about all the other ways that Iran interjects itself and involves itself in the region, particularly its relationship with actors like Hezbollah, Hamas, its role in Iraq with Shia militia, and so forth. So I think that, at least checking this element of Iranian power by containing and eliminating the prospect of it having a nuclear weapons capability would significantly reduce at least a major destabilizing aspect of the regional equation. It doesn't eliminate all of it because, again, so many of these concerns are related to other issues about Iran's role in the broader region, and in fact about the potential of Iranian normalization in the broader international community. So it's not going to eliminate these concerns, but I think it would remove a major destabilizing force and the potential for escalation that could lead to military conflict. And that would be a win for regional stability and certainly for U.S. interest.
Emad Kiyaei with the American Iranian Council. Do you agree with that analysis, especially with regard to Iran's involvement with Hezbollah and Iraq and Shia terrorist groups around the area?
Well, I think Dalia is on point in terms of the issues that are facing the Middle East. We are not just talking about Iran's nuclear file. There is a lot of other pressing issues that require involvement of all regional countries and international community to address, such as the situation in Iraq, Yemen, Syria, the fight against ISIS, and so forth. What's interesting is that if the nuclear file is resolved, if the comprehensive agreement is reached, it will remove a major bottleneck in terms of engaging between Iran and the U.S. on all these other fronts that Dalia has been mentioning. At the moment, everything has been pretty much stuck because we haven't reached a comprehensive deal. But I think that as a move forward, what will happen once there is a deal, this bilateral engagement between U.S. and Iran, for the first time after 3.5 decades, has allowed both the Rouhani administration and the Obama administration to really sit down face to face and on the sidelines of the nuclear negotiations to discuss these areas that both countries actually have mutual interest on. The fight against extremism that we've seen with the fight against ISIS, the two major countries that are on the forefront against this fight are Iran and the United States. So if we want stabilization in Iraq, if we want to negotiate with the Assad government to reach some level of truce or reconciliation in Syria, we need the Iranians on board. So this nuclear deal is not just about this file. I think it will not only strengthen non-proliferation in the region. Number two, if other countries in the region want to follow suit and build their own nuclear programs based on the framework that is agreed upon on these intrusive inspections and verification monitoring that Iran will have to agree upon, I believe is actually quite a safeguard against any diversion to nuclear weapons in the region. And number two, these basically interactions between regional countries and Iran by basically better rapprochement between a regional power such as Iran and a global power such as the United States will only be in the benefit of the region's stability and security. So I hope that we can remove this bottleneck and get on with it with more pressing issues such as the marred issues that we're facing in the region that requires U.S. and Iran to sit down together and discuss.
Dalia Dassa Kaye, get back to you with Iran Corporation. The deadline now is set for July 7th, I believe, which is next week. If it goes beyond that, Congress then will have an additional month to look it over. 30 days if the agreement is made before the 9th of July, 60 days after that. How important is that? And should the negotiators be concerned because there is a lot of skepticism about this in the Congress?
Well, they're certainly concerned. I don't think it's a coincidence that the deadline is now July 7th, trying to get a deal before this July 9th marking point in terms of the congressional timeline. But I don't think it should drive the negotiators and what they're trying to accomplish there. This is an extremely difficult, one of the most complex arms control agreements ever negotiated in a multilateral form. So I think they need to be driven by making sure this is a good deal, a verifiable deal, a deal that will last, a deal that, most importantly, both sides feel they have gained something from, because otherwise there will be no deal. So if it has to go past and there's a 60-day review period in Congress, it's more important that the details are right. Of course, that will increase the prospects for forces mobilizing against this deal to gain some force. But I think ultimately, if the terms of the deal are solid, then that debate can withstand. I think the deal can withstand that debate. And I think, as Dennis was suggesting, even the open letter, the bipartisan letter, many elements in there are already in the Lausanne framework. So I think that bipartisan support could help in the congressional discussion, showing that this deal is good for U.S. national security interests. And so I'm cautiously optimistic it could withstand even a 60-day period. But let's just see what happens. It may get done within the week. We'll see. It may get delayed longer. And if there's no deal, I think both sides have so much at stake. I think there'll be many efforts to try to resume negotiations and try to get a formula that both sides can ultimately agree to. But again, one of the most difficult periods will be after an agreement. Once this is done, if it's done, how it's implemented, and there'll be a lot of crisis, I think, that we can expect moving forward. And I think many actors in the region will be watching very closely to see how this deal is ultimately implemented if it happens.
Ambassador Ross, was your open letter, which you regarded as, or said was really a kind of a statement, designed in part to appeal to those in Congress who are dubious about this, to say the least?
Well, very much. The effort to produce something that was bipartisan is itself, I think, a statement and was very much shaped by our concern that if there are certain principles that really are going to be fulfilled that are essential to have such an agreement, can we get a bipartisan group to endorse them? And if so, that could be very useful on the Hill if, in fact, the agreement reflects these principles.
What is actually required from Congress?
Well, what is required from Congress is that, based on what the Cardin and Corker legislation provided, is that they would have a 30-day period, assuming the agreement is done by July 9th. They would have a 30-day period in which they could decide to approve, disapprove, or do nothing. This is not a treaty, but this was something that was worked out with the administration, and it's both houses of Congress. Now, if they were to vote, for example, a resolution of disapproval, and the president were to veto that, he could still go ahead and implement if there wasn't a two-thirds override in both houses. So it's a pretty high standard to be able to override what would be a presidential veto. But obviously it's much better if there is an agreement that gains support or at least some kind of acceptance on the Hill, because, as Dalia was saying, this is a very complicated agreement. To implement it is something that is going to be done over an extended period of time. You want succeeding administrations to feel that they have a stake in it as well, and that there's a kind of sufficient level of responsiveness from the Congress that it creates a certain moral authority with the agreement as well.
Very quickly, because we're almost out of time, what about President Netanyahu, who has been so outspoken against this again and again and again, and most recently on Sunday, saying that everything has been given away, essentially. How important is he, particularly in the Congress, and do you think he'll back down if, in fact, the agreement as currently drawn is the one that's ultimately agreed on?
Well, I think he does clearly have an effect in the Congress, because I think many of the concerns that he's raising strike a responsive chord. And I think it is very much in the administration's interest to address some of the concerns that he's raising. For example, one of the major concerns he has is that Iran will be left as a nuclear threshold state after 15 years. The move from threshold status to weapons would be a very small move. The president himself talked about basically no breakout time by year 13. So it's very important, I think, for the administration to make it clear that it will not permit Iran to move from threshold status to weapons status, and it would take whatever means are necessary to prevent that. That's one of the things we also put in our statement. I think if there were to be congressional endorsement of that principle, then that could go a long ways towards addressing the Israeli concerns.
Because we're talking about a long way down the road, and different people will be in offices by that time.
That's true. That's absolutely the case. In a sense, what the administration is doing is it's adopting a position not for itself, but it's making very clear and putting the world and the Iranians on notice that deterrence will become a very important element and part of the implementation of this agreement, so the Iranians shouldn't even be tempted to think about moving from threshold to weapon status.
All right. Former Ambassador Dennis Ross, Special Assistant to President Obama, for a couple of years, a longtime veteran negotiator between Israel and the Palestinians with the American involvement. Good to have you on our program. Thanks to Emad Kiyaei of the American Iranian Council, Dalia Dassa Kaye at the RAND Corporation, Center for Middle East Public Policy, Thomas Erdbrink, the Tehran bureau chief for the New York Times. Great to have you all.